Hi, and welcome to the Cosmic Pulse, sponsored by the International Academy of Astrology. Today, we are joined by few leaders in astrological education. I'd like to welcome and introduce Ena Stanley, who's the recipient of the Regulus Award for Education in 2012 and the founder of the International Academy of Astrology, as well as Enid Newberg, one of the founders, former president, and longtime astrology instructor at Kepler College. And last but not least, Sam Reynolds, president of the International Academy of Astrology, past board member of ISAR, and founder of International Society of Black Astrologers, who is a writer, speaker, and overall super cool dude. Thank you, and welcome to all of you for being here.
Thank you for having us, Jen.
Thank you, Jen.
The topic of today's podcast is to have you share your experiences and observations and thoughts of past and current patterns of astrological education. And I am a graduate of the International Academy of Astrology, and there are different models of or ways that a student can learn astrology. And I'm just wondering if we can maybe touch on some of them: self-study, the model of lineage, certification through either school or an organization, and thoughts on continuing studies. And how about we start with Ena, and if you could share how you started your astrological education and how you built IAA, and what other schools were around at that time. And Enid and Sam, also feel free to jump in.
Oh, I started my education by having my first astrological consultation, which I thought was going to be a hoax, and realized that it was the most significant thing I'd ever heard in all of my life. I was in my early 30s, about 32, I think, or so. Anyway, I'm now when we're recording this, the weekend that's coming up is going to be my 87th birthday. So that was some time ago that I started, and so I finally, I thought I was going to just get a book and know what this astrologer had said. So I got a book, and I got another book, and I got another book. There weren't that many books back in the 70s, but I got as many as I could get my hands on, and realized that all I was doing was learning just a tiny bit. In other words, I'd read this page and it made sense, but I'd turn the page and the next page didn't make sense. So I knew that I needed some classes. So I found a good teacher. She was a professional member of AFA, which was the only kid in town at that time, AFA was. And I learned from her. And then I was at the time, I was married to a Gestalt therapist, so I was very involved in psychology. So when I heard of Zipporah Dobbins, who was a clinical psychologist as well as an astrologer, I wanted to study with her, and I did. And then eventually I heard about NCGR. They were a fledgling organization at the time, and I wanted certification. That was very significant to me, to get some sort of peer testing that would tell me that I knew what I was talking about. So I ended up going and studying with Joan Negus. That was in 1985. And going to New York City and getting my certification because that you couldn't just get those tests anyplace at the time. And so after I got my third level, I started teaching. That was in 1986. I hadn't gotten my fourth yet, but it had to do more with finances than anything. And I didn't have the finances to do it at the time. And I started teaching because I realized that even the astrologer that had turned me on to astrology, who was supposed to be the professional astrologer I'd gone to, didn't know what she was talking about actually. So I wanted to start teaching so that people would know the depth of of astrology. And then we weren't even doing the traditional. That was just a twinkle in a few people's eyes, but it hadn't developed yet. So it was all modern. And but even at that, there was a lot of depth in that was not being shared by people who were saying that they were astrologers. That rubbed me the wrong way, that people saying they were astrologers, but they really didn't know that much about astrology. So then time went on. I ended up working in the mid 90s, early to mid 90s. I started working at a online community college called Cal Campus, CALCAMPUS. And that got me where I was familiar with online teaching. When I say online, the internet hadn't come out yet. And so I taught it Genie, I taught it Delphi. There was 2 or 3 that was the AOL wasn't even anything of any significance at the time. So I taught at these different little locations that they had contracts with, the school did. And in 1997, that spring semester, that beginning semester, I was teaching 13 classes a week, and I could not keep up the schedule. I was about to fall over from exhaustion. So I called up Ed Perrone and said, let's build a school. And that was the beginning of this school, which was at that time Online College of Astrology. And then in 2008, we changed the name to International Academy of Astrology.
Wow, that's a nice progression of history of technology as well, because we're talking all pre-internet. And I'm interested as well, feel free, Enid, to add in, what was the model for somebody before all this not this online, but the internet, for somebody who wanted to study with an astrology teacher or realize that they needed more than a book?
Teachers were not as easy to find either. Not just the books were hard to find. When I started in astrology, it was in college. I was in this brand new college in Washington called the Evergreen State College at the time, and a group of us were all interested in astrology. And so we wanted to find books, but this was in Olympia, not in the main city of Seattle, that had some astrologers. And we drove to Seattle to the Theosophical bookstore because it was the only place we knew of that you could actually find an astrology book to buy. And so we were learning together and finding out all this exciting information, like the signs have elements and modes that form a pattern. It was like this brand new information for us because we didn't have anything other than the books we were collecting. And the books tended to be, if you heard somebody mention another author, then you bought a book. If you heard that somebody was lecturing, then you might see if they had a book available because you liked what they said in the lecture. Finding a teacher was really tricky. I mean, if up in Seattle they had some teachers, so I actually never had an astrology teacher in my entire learning of astrology. I never actually went to study specifically under an instructor. It was through groups of people. Initially, I called myself also a self-defense astrologer because it was everybody around me who wanted to learn astrology, and I kind of clung to that name for a while, saying, no, I'm just a self-defense astrologer. I'm just learning it because everybody else I know. But it didn't take very long. It wasn't maybe more than 3 or 4 years before I realized that I couldn't say that. Not really. I was every bit as embedded into the astrology as my friends were. At that point, I'd had my first child, and my husband and he became the president of the Washington Astrological Association, and I was secretary for a while there along with him. And then I started to meet some of the top people that were coming through the lecture circuit. And then I tended to say, well, I'm not really a true astrologer, because I was encountering these people who I really respected that had really good knowledge. And I think the most of what I learned was in the discussions. Like, they would do their lectures and we'd all go out to dinner afterwards. And then people would talk astrology. And NORWAC was beginning to come up, and so pretty soon in the Seattle area there was a conference to go to where people would talk astrology, and that was the most exciting thing. But in 93 or 92 actually, Maggie Nalbandian had decided that she'd had enough of hearing people say they wanted to start a college, an actual formal academic college. No idea really what was going to be that college, but it was just people wanted it, so let's do it. And that was the start of Kepler. She got some people together, and at that time, my husband was my ex-husband, who was the astrologer, and Gary Lorenzen, and he would, going to the initial meetings, he would stop by the house to see the kids, and we would talk astrology. We would talk this new concept. So in 1993, I was also a member of the board of trustees for this new thought of new idea, and very excited at the concept of putting astrology as a field of study into the larger academic environment. And it was a marvelous dream. The astrological community was very much behind it, although I don't think in many cases they understood what they were asking for, because an academic study of astrology is a very different thing than having classes in the actual practice. The practice is not the central idea in an academic college. The underpinnings, the philosophy behind it, how it's shifted over time, what's the actual history. And when Kepler finally opened, that's really where we had to focus, because our remit from the state of Washington was that we had to present astrology in its academic context. So we had, instead of having just classes in what technique, we had classes that were comparing modern, Hellenistic, Vedic, or Indian astrology, and seeing the similarities and differences. We had an entire year of working with the history of astrology and discovering how amazing that history was. We had students who would start and they would say, I don't want to have history, forget it. I just want astrology. And then they would take that year, and so many of them said, that was the most valuable thing they had, was understanding how astrology is at the heart of civilization, both Western and Eastern. It is at the core underpinnings of the science, and we don't have to be ashamed at all of any of our history. We don't have to feel defensive against scientists. We cross borders astrology crosses the border between science and being human, and our intuition and our connection, literal connection with the larger cosmos. So that was really, I think, where the seeds of Kepler after accreditation were started, is because we were so excited about what happened when students got a broader picture. So when we did face the inevitable of not having money during the economic downturn, and also being considered the poster child for pseudoscience, none of the accrediting agencies wanted to touch us. And the one that we did want to work with, we were having real trouble. It's a very expensive process. And at that time, with the, this is 2008, where 2009. So we could not obtain accreditation in the time frame that the state of Washington required. And so we changed over in 2012 to being very similar to IAA, but with our own take on the idea that to really learn astrology, getting exposure to different styles of astrology, different lineages, being able to argue, because astrologers love to argue. Anybody who's been to a conference or even met another astrologer knows that we love to discuss all the different options of which house system to use, what planets do you include, what you not include, all those different things. And to have a background for that understands, well, that was around 3,000 years ago, and this one's just come in on the last 20, 30 years, is really important to place things and to get in more depth. So that was basically, and I think that that's been the basis behind IAA as well, is giving this broader exposure rather than a single person's perspective on what astrology is all about, but give a broader perspective of the larger astrological field, because we are a field of study. We're like psychology in that sense, that we have different branches, we have different ways of approaching. It's not that one is necessarily better than the other, but it's different approaches. And students, when you're starting astrology, you don't know which one you're really going to end up with. Chris Brennan is kind of the poster child for this. He came into Kepler College when he was a student going, there's, modern is the only possible way to do it because it's the best. Of course it is. And then having to basically being forced to learn an alternative like Hellenistic, all of a sudden he realized there's so much more and went into his own journey very, very far from where he ever thought he would start. And to me, that's the exciting part, is watching students discover their own pathway in places they didn't necessarily even know was of fascination to them.
That's lovely. And education at its highest is inspirational. And you can't be inspired by something if you're not exposed to it and you're not aware of it.
Yeah. And I want to say that I've always supported Kepler. Kepler, from the very beginning, before I even thought of a school, I was supporting the idea that what they were developing up in Washington. And the interesting thing is that both Enid and I have been very close companions through our journey for well over a decade.
Trading stories, trading ideas about how to best approach education. Very
Yes.
fruitful conversations.
And your reference to learning from books and having access to astrology books, I don't know how many were in the library, but to me, there's a certain degree of privilege, I think, in astrological education, because it's not readily accessible in public schools or public libraries in public schools. And I don't know, Sam, did you want to talk about privilege and astrology at all, or Enid or Ena, if you want to talk about just trends that you noticed in terms of privilege or the changing,
Well, I mean,
landscape of astrologers, the
yeah,
makeup.
we can go into that. I mean, I came to astrology very different, well, not very different, but different than Ena and Enid in the sense that I wasn't committed to my astrological education and journey as such, as much as I was fascinated by astrology as a field of BS. So I spent 10 years trying to disprove it. But I think I did that in a reasonable way, which was between accessing books that I could buy or find, which I'll talk more about per your question, and by doing charts. And how I came to do charts, it was a little later than Ena and Enid because I'm just a little younger. Um, um, they're probably laughing because it's like, oh, you're a lot younger. But
You are.
but yeah, I came to it in the late 90s. More so, I should say mid to late 90s, because my first exposure to astrology was probably 90 itself, and then 91, and then I got a Mac computer program that allowed me to do charts, and it was always with the intention that someone would say to me like, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard from anybody, but it never came. No one ever said that. Even as I would do these charts with friends, I had no aspiration toward being an astrologer. I just wanted to study something hands-on that made no sense to me.
So
And I couldn't.
you weren't charging your friends to disprove astrology, because that'd be pretty funny.
No. I didn't start charging until probably close to 10 years later. And even then it wasn't charging. It was initially just donation for the work I was doing. And that only came about because someone, I didn't have a fee, and I didn't even have a minimum for donation. So I did a whole reading, which was, in those times, a lot of prep for me. And when I say a lot of prep, meaning I probably would spend half the day for what I thought would be an hour session or 2 hours. And so someone, when I did a reading for them, was like, well, thank you. This was wonderful, Sam. Let me get your tea. So she bought my tea. I was like, I just worked all that for tea. So I started coming up with a minimum donation, which I think at the time was $40 or $60. I don't remember now. This would have been 1999, 2000, actually, just as I was about to move to New York. And going to your point now, coming back to privilege, no, I had, was once a graduate student, and then immediately following graduate school, I was more of a starving artist, poet, spoken word artist, and actor. So I didn't have a lot of money, extra money for books. So the libraries didn't really have as much in terms of actual quality materials. So I would go to Barnes and Noble or Borders and sit there for hours and read their books. And then the ones I just couldn't put down or felt like I needed to buy, like Parker's Astrology, I bought. And that was my purchase for, I won't say the year, but maybe for a couple of months or so. And I would devour those books. And again, always with the intention, like, I want to understand more about this. But to privilege, I would say that as a Black man, having gotten an advanced degree, a master's in African American Studies, I think the aspects of privilege, whether we're talking about race, gender, and mainly we're talking about white women at some particular point, comes at a threshold when a certain group has a disposable income to be able to dedicate itself toward the study of astrology. And for a certain ethnicity, certain groups, that's fairly recent. So maybe white women in the States, I can't speak about anywhere else. I'm not talking about Europe. I'm not talking about Canada really. But what I've kind of cataloged in the States, initially, they may have had some access to some resources to study astrology from, working or wealthier partners. Mainly, this might have been like the 70s and 80s. And then
That's
many
right.
more women later on started being able to work for themselves and then having their own disposable income. And then we had a smaller crop of astrologers, women astrologers, who were doing astrology full time and making a living at it. Now that's shifting, and we have a greater diversity. This also may have been true for many of the gay populations or gay lesbian populations. Now we're seeing a broadening of that ethnicity, by ethnicity and along the LGBTQIA spectrum. And I think this is the model that we can expect to see in other parts of the world. Like I went to South Africa in 2015. I was at a conference hosted there, and I was the only Black astrologer in, let me say it again, South Africa. And at first I was peeved by that, but then I started talking to the organizer and different people who also were attending, and they explained to me that there's a couple different factors to consider that may not be true for the States, for example. One is the religious factor. In many parts of Africa and other parts of the world, astrology is still, maligned according to a religious and cultural spectrum. Then there are more people, especially in South Africa after the liberation from apartheid, people who wanted to get like traditional jobs and traditional education, who didn't necessarily have the disposable income to like then study astrology, because that wasn't like seen as one, a legitimate profession, and also one that would make them money. I think that's starting to shift. Now we have again, this is even just 8 years later, I'm getting more and more word of people, of Black people in Africa in general, but also in South Africa in particular, who may have a little more resources to be able to study astrology. So I think privilege is in the mix, but I think, one of the things that with the pandemic became a great equalizer, where suddenly people had access to information and access to classes and different things that kind of broke through barriers that existed before.
I love how you and Enid both use the word cross borders, because Ena, I see you as, I've said it before, a trailblazer in that you pioneered, I think, online education when that was, not the norm, that it seems to have become more with COVID and the shutdown, and now there's hybrid. Even in universities, the courses were either online or in person. The online was still fairly new, I think, for even universities or distance remote education.
I think the only university that was functioning online at that time was called Phoenix.
There were a couple others, but like when Kepler opened shortly after IAA, and we, as I referred to it, we were on the bleeding edge of online education, of trying to figure out how to make it work. Our solution at the time was to try have an in-person component, because there is that quality of people getting together. And the symposia were amazing. The students would just go nuts. If they'd have their class, they'd get talking afterwards. The teachers were getting exhausted, so they would be going to bed, although some of them stayed up all night too. Half of the students were staying up all night, and they were talking astrology. They in just all the things that they were learning. It was marvelous, and it's something that right now we have conferences is the closest we can come to that.
You're listening to the Cosmic Pulse from the International Academy of Astrology. We'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Ena Stanley. I'm the founder of the International Academy of Astrology, and I'd like to thank you for listening to our podcast, The Cosmic Pulse. If you'd like to find out more about our certification program in astrology or all of our other activities, please visit our website at astrocollege.org.
It's kind of like this layering that goes on in terms of how learning happens. When you're in person, your whole body is involved in the learning. When you're online, you've got the face if you're using video, although it's only recently that video doesn't overwhelm a class site, online class site, but you at least have a live interaction. And that's one of the things I think both IAA and certainly Kepler does, but I know you're also very committed to that, having a live instructor so that you have a live portion, even if it is online, is different than just, there's a lot of new educational opportunities for astrologers that's all passive learning. Just sit there and listen to a recording. And as studies have shown, and I've seen it even in myself, that it's very true. You listen to an online recording and you can be fascinated, but within an hour, you can be asked about what's covered and half of it's already gone. And within a day, you're down to maybe 20% that's still left in your brain. So you can't really replace the same level. I mean, you have somewhat similar happen within person, but because you've been present and ready to interact, it's a very different form of learning.
That's the real time factor that we're talking about. And without going too much into a rabbit hole with AI and how that could, I think, maybe even threaten the human race. That was my thought earlier with like Pluto in Aquarius, is because of the AI potentially eliminating a bunch of jobs. Where would that leave most of a certain group of society? So that real-time factor, as well as I think certification, can you talk about the differences of certification and how the advantages of that, coming from from various experiences of learning without a teacher and then in a school setting?
Well, can I shoot first on that? I would say one of the benefits of being an autodidact, and self-taught, is that you have control of your learning, sure, and access to materials. One of the problems of being self-taught and an autodidact is that you don't know what you don't know. And so you can get locked into your own biases and think you may know astrology when you only know some part of astrology. Now, there's always more to learn with astrology, but one of the advantages of an education in astrology, not just a certification, but an education in astrology, especially at IAA or Kepler, is that these are comprehensive schools where you're exposed to multiple teachers and multiple forms of astrology. The benefit of the certification process as offered by the organizations is then you have the laying of hands on you from some other people who can say that you have, passed a certain threshold of understanding and learning related to your astrology. Here's where I think the organizations, even being on the board for one, overstep greatly with their certification process because they don't openly acknowledge the centrality of the schools in this process. Well, they might argue like, of course we do. We require 500 hours or X number of hours from the schools in order to do that. Sure, okay, so I go through it and I have a diploma, but then I have to go and take your organization's certification, right? And then, one particular organization will say, well, our schools pay a fee, $500 to $1,000 in order to be a member, an affiliated school with us. And it's like, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous because central to this is education. And so certification is good as a laying of hands tradition. I am drawing that from the church, but there's other traditions and also pointing to an aspect of lineage. But I think it's really education. And this goes also in the face of, the one house school, the one room school systems. The one room school systems are the schools where there's mainly one central teacher who teaches their form of astrology. And again, the limit can be that you know this one form of astrology, but you may not know how it ties in with other forms of astrology. You might say, well, why do I need to know other forms of astrology? Well, I think on some level, having an understanding of the worlds of astrology or astrologies is part of being an informed astrologer. One great thing about our systems of education in medicine is that, yeah, there might be someone who has a speciality, but you have different residencies that you can do to figure out more what you want to do in the worlds of medicine. So an ophthalmologist won't say about a psychiatrist like, well, yeah, that's not my specialization, but I don't know anything about that. You know something of it in the realm of psychiatry, even though that may not be your practice. But you have astrologers like, well, I practice Hellenistic astrology. Well, what do you think about the Huber system? I've never heard of it, right? Or what about Uranian astrology? I don't know if that's valid, right? I don't know if there's any Hellenistic astrologer who might say that, but just as an example, they may not know about it. That's my take.
So that's touching on the quality of education as well, not just the act of or attempt at education. And what I'm hearing is in the one room schoolhouse, maybe you're like those painters in the Renaissance where you became a replica of a great master. And the one room schoolhouse, seeing it through the perspective or eyes of the instructor versus at Kepler or Ena, the International Academy of Astrology, where it's, correct me, you're building your own critical thinking and knowledge or perspective. Do you want to add to any of that?
Well, yeah, if I can, and then I'll shut up and defer to my elders. Yeah, I mean, I think, well, one, I don't want anyone to feel as they listen to this that I'm disparaging one room schoolhouses, right? And they definitely give a lot of value, but I think we've leaned too far in. And by the way, I also have a one room schoolhouse, meaning that I also offer classes. But one thing I encourage, I don't give any certification, and one of the reasons why I don't give any certification is that I don't want anyone to feel like their education related to astrology is done just by virtue of studying with me. Whereas I would grant that to like diploma granting institutions like IAA and Kepler or FAS Faculty of Astrological Studies in London or Mayo, because there's a host of other teachers and ideas. So I don't know if I'm approaching your question. What's the other essence of your question there with that?
My goal is to get you guys talking.
Okay, but what did you ask me? I like to answer what's been-
Oh, I was comparing the, I guess, outcome of
Oh,
a
quality.
student
Well, yeah.
from a one-room schoolhouse versus an astrology school, and some of the differences, I guess, in terms
Well,
of the
Enid
student's
touched-
formative formation as an astrologer.
Enid touched on this. So there's something called metacognition, right? When you start being able to think about what you're studying. The advantage of these schools, like IAA and Kepler, is that we get you thinking about astrology not just as practitioner, but as someone like not just critical thinking, but someone involved in understanding the realm and worlds of astrology. I think this is important because when someone comes to me, they're like, well, I want you to teach me astrology. I always qualify and say, I will teach you astrology I know, but there are astrologies, right? When I first started learning astrology, I wish someone had told me, like, there are various forms of astrology that you can learn. And there's no one way in which you can learn astrology. But I was thinking, just like you learn psychology or you learn other things, like, oh, then this is the way to learn it. That's not true. It's multidisciplinary and it's vast. And I think the quality of education you get in a school, a comprehensive school like IAA and FAS and Kepler, is more so going to be related to understanding the complexities of astrology and being able to think about, what we say as astrologers. Because there's some astrologers who, and this is going to be a critique, right? There's some astrologers like, well, I do what works. I'm practical. I don't get into theory. Well, the skeptic in me, the former skeptic, is like, well, it just seems like for you astrologers, anything can work, right? You could talk about the astrology from your bedroom window or your kitchen window and think that that works. And maybe it does. Like when the moon is just half mast between, my neighbor's satellite dish and, the pole next to it, this means a particular thing. You literally could do that, but is that going to be related to the universal language of astrology? No, but you could practice it whatever way, but are all practices equal? And I don't think they are, because we have to look at the philosophy, the language, the lineage, all these other things related to it. All
And
right.
well, that also brings up a corollary with that, and it's the internet, which is an anything goes right now. And I mean, you can find just about any variety of astrology you want out there. How do you decide when somebody is just doing bullshit or when someone is just completely making something up because they read one book in astrology and they said, I can do a website, I can pretend to be, I know how to write, I know how to be charismatic. They don't necessarily know much of anything, but they can make an appearance that looks legit. As someone who doesn't know astrology, you have no way to really evaluate that. As a beginning student, you may not really, you may be bedazzled by someone's really clever use of language that sounds so profound without having any background to say, is it profound or does it sound profound? And there are a lot, it's like the self-help movement, where you could have almost interchangeable people coming on stage with their book saying, and this, I have the way to make your lives better. And very soon, it didn't take many years before people started to realize that a lot of the people who were coming on stage to do that were making their life very better because they were making money.
Yes.
But that wasn't making your life better. So like what?
No, it's just when you were describing the blend of Jupiter and Neptune versus having Jupiter, Neptune with Saturn.
Yes. basically. So for the goal of a comprehensive school is very different than we just want you to be able to practice astrology. It's also we want you to be able to practice it in a way that you understand why you're making your choices, your own choices. And I always feel that it's also, I have never met a good astrologer who has not continually been learning. And I don't perceive of the schools as, okay, you've received a diploma and that's the end of your learning. I perceive that as now you really have a solid enough understanding that whatever is fully pulling on your heart to say, that's the style, that's where I'm going, is you're making that choice because you actually have some background, not just because some teacher said, oh, that's the way I do it, and so you should too. You're making it because it's your own heart calling. And I think that's part of why a comprehensive school is so valuable, because you have you have different teachers, you have different types, and you get a chance to play with it in amongst a group of people who are also playing with this, who have knowledge, and it's exciting. To me, that was when astrology really opened up, was when I started actually having an experience of different astrologers and different ways that they were approaching, instead of just the books that I tended to get because they already fit the books I already had. And for astrology, for its future, because it is such a broad field, we need the comprehensive schools. We need different ways. I don't ever perceive as Kepler being in competition with IAA. We have slightly different teaching styles that fit different styles of learning.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, and we're complementary to each other rather than antagonistic to each other.
Exactly.
I mean, if we would not have so many different colleges for people to choose from on ordinary colleges if there weren't a value in having different approaches to the same style of, or the same commitment to education. I won't say
Yes.
necessarily style, but commitment.
Yes. Yeah.
A wonderful way to talk about and address inclusivity and strength base, that not in competition or either or, but together investing in quality education.
Mm-hmm. And
Yes.
investing in different voices. And those voices come from life experience, comes from education experience, comes from, well, just all the different ways life will bounce all of us around, and we come with different perspectives. But as astrologers, it seems I've never quite understood when they've wanted to narrow the field to, no, this is just the right one. And because yes, you could say, here's what's common from Hellenistic to modern, with some small variations, but there's a certain core thread. But there's also pieces along that thread where we've branched into other directions as astrologers. And it's worth seeing where that branch occurred, why it occurred, and how much of that still in this particular culture at this time can provide us with perhaps a way of looking at things that takes us out of our own ruts and into a new configuration. I think for me, that's always the exciting part in astrology, when I discover another piece, or when I have a student who comes from a completely different background than I do, and they come up with just, I would have never thought of that. It's probably the most exciting part about being involved.
But before we wrap up, because Enid, you have both Kepler and IAA perspectives of curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
can you maybe touch on you know, does Kepler run a curriculum that's like that in each course has the student explore the modern and traditional at the same time, or is that something that is unique to Ena Stanley's?
This is conversations between Ena and I many years.
Oh.
As well as, we both have the perspective that if you introduce a technique, you should also introduce its lineage, in a sense, is basically it. So we do have modern, we do have traditional, and always identifying where they differ, so that a student can play with the different techniques, but also know what, you know, this was this focus, this was, and actually this brings one other piece to me, is that there is still a trend that started with the first translations of the Hellenistic materials of modern astrologers saying, you know, no, the traditional is all too predictive, it's too fatalistic, it's too this, or the traditional astrologers saying, oh, the modern astrologers haven't understood this and they haven't figured out that. They're not antagonistic. The two systems can actually do a remarkably good job of feeding the best of each into each other and giving new ways of working with the chart. And there's also a part of this argument that I think sometimes people forget, that if you really, really go into the core symbols, they are so powerful, they are so in-depth, that you can come from either the traditional or the modern and never go beyond adding every other technique under the sun and have an astounding understanding of how the chart works in any individual case. This is something that I really came to understand, particularly teaching astrology, is how powerful our symbols are and how much a lot of the techniques that we've developed can sometimes be laid to the fact that we haven't understood the basic symbols, and sometimes to the fact that there's all these other tools, and occasionally they can be useful, but are they the key? Are they the core? So when, like I like to say, I spent the first 20 years gathering every technique I could. I spent the next 20 years getting rid of most of the techniques. And now I'm basically going, okay, I've got the core and I'll use this when I need it for this particular instance.
Yes, I've been so glad that I've had I've had the knowledge that I've had about astrology, because if I'm doing a chart and I know something about the chart and I'm going, this is just not working, then I can pull out Anticia, I can pull out different things, and I can find how it is working that I couldn't see, you know, just with this narrow amount of knowledge that I started off with in the 70s. So.
Yeah, and it's like a chant I do sort of for my students is, you know, planets rule.
Yes.
And if you keep that in mind, what you realize is you can have like the key signature of the chart and the melodic theme. What a lot of those other techniques do is it's like bringing in extra colors in a painting or bringing in a counterpoint in a piece of music, but they don't ever take over and replace what that core theme is all about. And sometimes I think when you have just a single teacher, or when you're trying to do it by yourself, it's much easier to lose track of what's really the core theme. in all astrology. And so I think there are common places that we as astrologers can agree is key to our astrological education that can free us for reconfiguring and thinking how the other pieces fit. I go ahead, Nina.
Oh, I was just thinking that as I'm listening to you, that when we're talking about individual ideas about astrology, that that is more narrow than a broader education. I was thinking, God, that sounds like religion, Christianity specifically. Not all religions, but this, so there's the Baptist and there's the Catholics and there's the Methodist and then there's this and this and this. And they don't look at I don't see astrology as a religion. And that kind of puts it into that, pigeonholes it into that category. And that to me is dangerous to, just have different
silence.
little. Yes, there's no, yeah, there has to be a balance or an overview to be able to understand the
And-
true workings of astrology.
And that's when it gets really exciting. Having the conversations between what's traditional, what's modern, what seems to work, why you would use it, why you wouldn't, is it helped me doing that. I mean, that was part of why I really got into astrology and started admitting, yes, I'm not just a self-defense astrologer. I'm right in here, is because that was so exciting and it gave me such a depth of understanding that I wasn't getting. It gave me new ways of thinking about it. And I think astrology it does fulfill a spiritual niche in the sense of like a Zen koan or a Sufi tale, where you have these tales that you can revisit. The sound of one hand clapping is such a typical, here's a Zen koan. Well, that stuck in my head. And a couple of the other ones, before enlightenment, chopping wood and carrying water. After enlightenment, chopping wood and carrying water. They're simple little thingies. And I discovered that by sticking in my head over years, I kept getting new insights out of those little simple phrases. I kept getting new places where, oh my goodness, that is exactly, I understand from an inside. And I think astrology symbols are like that. You can revisit, what does the sun mean? What does the moon mean? Again and again and again, and every time come up with new depth.
Yeah, Rob, I'm going to quote Rob Hand here. I heard him say one time that astrology will not bring you to enlightenment, but you can gain enlightenment through astrology. It won't do it for you, but you can find it while you're studying. I know it has certainly done that for me.
And I mean, I actually, Sam, I do kind of recognize where you came from into astrology, because my kids have often beat me over the head over how many times I have said it's not supposed to work, but it does.
Right. Well, and that's kind of the thing that I'm grateful about in terms of furthering my education, either through the certification program. I've never been enrolled in a school, but I have studied with teachers. I've studied with Alan Oken, Christopher Warnock, Robert Zoller, John Marcusella, Mark Woltz. So I've had the privilege of teachers over time. But what I was going to say too to this point is that even though not everything goes, I think in astrology, I do think there are multiple roads that will take us to where we need to go beyond Rome, right? I think you can go to a Vedic or sidereal astrologer and get a similar set of messages that you might get from a tropical Western traditional astrologer. but we kind of, for whatever reason, maybe akin to what we find in religion, we feel this need to have the one, you know, the one method. And some measure of that, I'm going to chalk up sometimes to ignorance, that people don't know that there can be other ways. And some people have the desperate, I will say that, desperate need for this one thing as true, not recognizing that other things can also be true simultaneously.
And maybe it's for feelings of security or predictability. I really appreciate listening to your experiences and outlooks. And one thing I wanted to conclude with that we weren't really planning on talking about this, but I want to acknowledge the amount of work and passion that Enid, you put into Kepler, and Ena, that you've put into IAA, as well as Sam as the current president, because talking about that quote of being led to, fulfillment, I think I really cherish my diploma from IAA. And so to have these schools available, I still to this day, like, I feel there's, IAA gave me such a good foundation
Thank
and
you.
preparedness, and also the work that gets put in to keep the curriculum updated and improved is, I think, a testament to the commitment and passion that goes beyond, just delivering information. It's a lot of work to run a school.
Yep. Yep. Enid and I know that. We used to spend hours talking to each other about it.
Yes, all of the various things, and not just in the basic running, but even decisions on what you do with curriculum. How do you best reach students? That's another advantage of, like, having a school where you have multiple teachers and multiple approaches, is you have all of these people who can contribute to saying, where is it working, where isn't it, what is truly essential, what is something that we want to offer because it's just, there's going to be people who want this. And finding that mix, finding the balance, finding the rhythm of how the classes work. Teaching is often denigrated, especially in the United States these days.
Oh,
and there is, sometimes I think there has been a thought in the astrological community that's along the same sort of lines, is, oh, I can make my money doing clients, and I can make my money doing this, and I can always teach a class, and I can always do it stuff, without really thinking through what it means to really try open your students' eyes to what you're trying to tell them, and letting them have the tools they need to take it and run and just go with it, because they've actually been able to learn it. Unfortunately, I think sometimes we translate, well, I've listened to a lecture, as I've actually learned the information. And it's not until you actually practice and put it to use and test it that you can say you've learned information.
and get feedback.
And get feedback from it. And that's one thing that IAA is committed to, is providing that feedback, providing that pathway, and re-looking at it. I mean, something that Kepler does all the time as well, is we re-look at the curriculum. Well, it's partly because we're constantly in a dialogue with our students. As your students go through, and when you have a larger program like that, you're getting so many more voices. And the voices can come, the best way to move forward can come from a student as well as from a teacher.
Absolutely, absolutely. I've learned more from the students that I have taught throughout the years than I ever learned in any book.
And it's like our clients teach us so much once we start.
And
Right.
there's a theme that I'm hearing that's a nurturement that is in line with this season of our quarterly podcast, the Cancer Ingress of the Cosmic Pulse. And with that, I want to thank everyone here for their time. And I just feel so lucky to be able to learn from and work with all of you. And to our listeners, is there anything that you would like to say in conclusion?
Oh, I just
Before I
want to
wrap
say
it up.
thank you, Jen.
Yes.
It's great to see a grad of IAA doing this work and also being part of our board. Excuse me. Thank
Bless
you. Yeah. Thank you. And bless you.
And bless you. All right.
And yes, and thank you, Jen. You've always been a shining light for me.
I always like to say how I am such a proud graduate of the International Academy of Astrology because it was worth every penny, dollar.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, that wraps it up.
You've been listening to the Cosmic Pulse from the International Academy of Astrology. New episodes are released at the solstices and equinoxes. Find us wherever you get your podcasts, as well as at astrologyflix.com. See you next time.
Hi, I'm Ed Perrone. I'm the video archivist for the International Academy of Astrology, and I'd like to invite you to try our new video streaming service, Astrologyflix. Astrologyflix is like Netflix for astrology. Subscribers receive full access to a curated library of astrology lectures, workshops, mini courses, and other material from some of the leading astrological minds of our time. Watch videos from Robert Hand, Rick Levine, Robert Schmidt, Samuel F. Reynolds, Donna Van Toen, Joni Patry, Nicholas Campion, and many, many more. We're adding new videos twice a month, so you'll always find something new and stimulating. Check us out at astrologyflix.com.